Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending today's webinar, where the Treasurer's Office, the 11th District of Chicago Police Department, and TransUnion will present Credit 101 Virtual Financial Education Program, designed to empower all Chicago residents, no matter where they are on their wealth-building journey. Today, we are excited to have our presenters, TransUnion, and a representative, Jean. Thank you, Jean, for supporting and participating with us. Take it away.
Thank you, Mark-Gail, and thank you all for taking such valuable time out of your busy schedules to listen to me. As a way of quick introductions, my name is Gene Wilczek. I'm a Senior Vice President at TransUnion, one of 3 major credit reporting agencies, and we're headquartered here in Chicago. I'm really passionate to talk about the topic of credit for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's been my profession for nearly 35 years. But probably more importantly, because credit was so essential to my parents who came here as refugees when I was a child, when we settled in Chicago and I was a kid. And credit and access to credit for them was absolutely essential to get our lives foundationally started in the United States. So it's a passion for me, not only because it's professional, but also because of my personal journey. And we can advance the slide, please. So credit, the tenets of credit and why healthy credit is important is for a number of reasons. And as soon as the slide advances, we'll see those reasons. There we go. Thank you. Number one is, as was my personal journey, access to borrowing opportunities. And of course, credit is debt. It's money that must be paid back, and therefore credit costs money. It's called interest rates. Interest is the cost of money. And so therefore, managing our credit and keeping a healthy credit profile is important in order to lower our cost of credit when we do need access to that credit. And as we'll talk about, having a healthy credit profile is important not just for borrowing needs, but as you will see in many, many cases where credit is used, that really impacts our adult lives. Next slide, please. So what is a credit report? That is the foundation to most credit decisions. It is the content that's found on our credit report. Credit report is, as I like to call it, it's the adult report card. We all received report cards in school, which showed our academic progress, showed a lot of other information like attendance record and the dates associated with the subjects we may have taken and so on. Our adult report card is the credit history that we have experienced. It's any loans we may have taken out, our history of payback on those loans, how we manage our credit, and so on. All of that information is compiled by credit reporting agencies. And it demonstrates to lenders, among other things, your credit capacity and capability to repay those debts based on your historical performance with those obligations. It shows really the types of credit you have had and the length of time you may have had credit experience. All these factors go into, as we'll learn in just a moment, what's called a credit score. So it's, again, our adult report card. Next slide, please. Now, this is an eye chart. I apologize. So this is illustrative. But for those of you who may not seen a credit report or have not seen your own credit report, it basically consists of items including your personally identifiable information. That's the items you see on the left-hand side of this chart. What is personally identifiable information? It's basically anything that identifies you as an individual. Your name, your address, date of birth, sometimes employment, sometimes previous address. It's basically demographic information. Keep that in mind when we talk about credit scores, because the things you see on the left-hand side do not factor in. In fact, it's illegal for any of those items to go into a credit score. The items you see on the right-hand side usually are over pages and pages when you print your own credit report or you scroll through a digital site. And that's because it shows any and all credit accounts you may have had historically. Usually most adults in the US have their first entry into credit with a credit card. Now, by law, you must be 18 years of age before you can sign a legally binding contract, a credit card application. That's what that is. However, you can obtain a credit card as an authorized user before the age of 18. If, for example, an adult at home, such as a parent or a legal guardian, already has such a credit card, they may authorize you access, and a credit report will show up with that account as an authorized user. But most adults have their first credit experience when they turn 18. And it's not necessarily always a credit card. It could be a student loan. It could be an auto loan, any other type of a loan. And the information associated with that account and all accounts are the dates that each of these loan obligations were opened, the credit limit or the loan amount, the balance, payment information, and historical payment information. And of course, the type of loan it might be. So imagine if you have more than one of these types of loans, all of that would be contained in the credit report. These are what are called trade lines. Additionally, on the credit report are public record information and collection items. These are typically negative. So hopefully none of you will experience that. But what is usually found in those sections are things like liens or bankruptcies would be in public record. Collection items, unfortunately, when there's a bad debt, doesn't have to be credit necessarily. It could be, for instance, an unpaid parking tickets in the city of Chicago. Anything that is owed money on that wasn't paid and may have been sold to a third party, such as a collection agency, they will report that bad debt on a credit report. So those are really the components of what goes into our adult report card. And all of those items, except the demographics, are what impact and what determine our credit scores. Next slide, please. So how does credit reporting work? It's what's called a give-to-get model, which means to be a subscriber to a credit reporting agency, you have to have what's called a permissible business purpose. And credit seeking is one of those. So all of these loans that you see represented here, whether it's an auto loan, a mortgage to finance a home, a student loan to finance an education, or a credit card to make purchases of all sorts and all kinds of items, these are all reported to the credit reporting agency. And then those who have permissible purpose, such as a landlord, a lender, an employer even, can access a credit report. And they can also see potentially a credit score that's derived out of this information. So it's sort of a circular process. The information is compiled by credit reporting agencies, and it's offered back to those who have permissible purpose to view it. But essentially, again, any loan obligation would be reflected on a credit report. And keep in mind, there are 3 credit reporting agencies in the United States: Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. Most of them contain very much similar information, but some of the items reported could vary for a number of different reasons. Some lenders, for instance, only report to one credit reporting agencies. But for all practical purposes, the information is very, very similar, if not exact, across the 3 credit reporting agencies. Next slide, please. So then what is a credit score? I just mentioned all this information that's contained on our adult report card or a credit report is then enumerated into a credit score. Most credit scores are 3 digits, ranging from the low 300 to the highest 850. Where the higher the score, the lower the credit risk, means the better it is. And I mentioned credit risk. Essentially, that's what a credit score is. It is a probability, the probability of on-time future repayment of a loan obligation. So a lower the score, the higher the probability of future default. And the higher the score, the lower the likelihood that you may go delinquent in the future. Therefore, it's highly desirable to keep the score as high as possible. Next slide, please. We'll talk more about credit scores. First, what goes into a credit score? Again, to reiterate, the items on a credit report, starting at the top there, payment history and payment information, specifically on-time payment, any historical or current delinquencies, if there is a delinquency in the history, how recent was the last time it may have been delinquent, the account may have been delinquent. By far, this is the largest component of a credit score. About 35% of what determines a score is based on that payment history. So I will repeat this multiple times as we progress. On-time payment history is what drives the score either to be high, which is desirable, or unfortunately low, which is undesirable. The second most important thing is credit usage, and specifically credit utilization. And this comes into play. We'll have an illustration here in a few slides, especially with credit cards. Why? Because every type of an installment loan, such as a home loan or a car loan or a student loan, have a very specific purpose. They have one loan amount, a specific time period to repay it, and therefore equal installments each month that are required to pay back. A credit card, however, is a loan to the extent that we as consumers allow it to be a loan. Meaning, if we do not pay off the entire balance at the end of each cycle, at the end of each month, then that balance becomes a credit card loan. And that impacts utilization. The higher the balance relative to the credit limit, I'll describe that in a few slides. Hopefully that'll be more clear. Then utilization is higher. That negatively impacts the score. So it's kind of it sounds like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth here. I'm suggesting credit is important in order to have access to the true credit needs, such as financing a home, a car, and so on. But too much credit or having too large balances, especially on credit cards, could actually hurt your credit score. So we want to have a fine balance there. Now, age of your credit history is just a natural manifestation of time. Again, most adults in the United States obtain their first credit at the age of 18. So as you age and as you demonstrate your experience with credit, time is sort of on your side. And so if nothing else, if you've never missed any payments, if you have one or two or a few credit accounts, your score will naturally increase over time simply because the age demonstrates that you have a longer history of managing your credit. New credit or inquiries. So this sort of is counterintuitive. Again, why would applying for a new credit actually hurt your score? Well, because empirically, and again, that's what credit scores are, it's empirical evidence of the past that shows that new accounts usually demonstrate credit neediness. And so again, when you open a new account or you inquire to apply for a new loan, your credit score will typically be lowered. But again, if all else is equal, if you make all your payments on time, that decrease will typically be very temporary. And in a matter of months, that score will go back up and probably increase because now you're showing responsible credit with yet another account. And then, of course, different types of credit, the more mix and variety you have as you gain greater experience with credit, that also helps your score. So, for example, having a credit card, having an installment loan, having a finance company loan, different combinations also help to increase your score. But again, cannot emphasize this enough. By far, the largest factor is that thing on top, payment history, on-time payment. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned before, it is equally important to appreciate the fact that demographic information do not factor into scores. So age, race, religion, any of those items, your employment information, do not factor into credit scores. And let me take the moment right now to explain the difference between a soft inquiry and a hard inquiry. A hard inquiry is the actual application for credit. So when you either take that offer that might come into your mail and you respond either by mail or on your mobile device or on a computer, you say, yeah, I want that credit card. That goes in as an application for credit. That's a hard inquiry. And of course, if you walk into a dealership to purchase a car and the dealer pulls your credit report and then sends it to a credit union or a number of different banks, those are all inquiries. Now, the good news with that example, it's important to point out, is they are all deduplicated because ultimately a dealer wants to move metal, right? They want to sell you that vehicle. And it may come down to whether you can afford it based on your financing ability. So they will send it typically to more than one financial institution to see which one could get you the best rate, the lowest interest rate. So if 5 different institutions, for example, see your car loan application, that will only be reported to the credit reporting agency as one inquiry. It'll be deduplicated. So you do not need to be concerned about multiple applications all at once. The same goes for mortgage applications. If you're shopping around for mortgage and within I believe it's a 14-day period, if you have multiple lenders that may be looking at your credit file, that will only count as a single inquiry. Now, if every month or every other month you do the same, those will show up as unique inquiries and they will ding your score. A soft inquiry, however, never impacts your score. What is a soft inquiry? That is a promotional inquiry. So, for example, the junk mail you may receive either from a creditor or an insurance company advertising their goods and services, they basically screened your file to see if you would qualify for one of their offers, and they presented you with that offer. That shows up as a soft inquiry, which means when you view your own credit file, only you can see that soft inquiry. No one else, other lenders, cannot see the soft inquiries. Therefore, the soft inquiries do not factor into the scores. Another example of a soft inquiry is if you already have a credit card account, for example, most credit card issuers will do what's called a portfolio review. Once you become a customer, as an existing cardholder, they have the right to view your file as frequently as daily, but typically most of them do it on a monthly basis. Why? To see if your credit risk has changed since the time that you applied for credit. So you may be paying that credit card company on time as agreed, but there may be other risk factors with other lenders, and that's what they're looking for when they do a portfolio review. They also review your file periodically to see if you qualify for a credit line increase or other marketing offers that they may want to present to you. So those are all examples of soft inquiries which do not factor into credit scores at all. Next slide, please. Okay, a few credit tips. I already mentioned it, but it bears repeating many, many times. Please make all your payments on time, each and every time, because that is the number one factor that impacts your score. Keep your balances as low as possible. And let me just say this with regard to credit cards, especially with regards to credit cards. If you have the option of making the minimum payment only, that is the lesser evil than not making any payments at all, because missing a payment will ding your score the most. The next worst thing you can do is just make that minimum payment. Why? Because it won't impact your score. You will be reported as paid as agreed. However, it becomes a very expensive loan. The APRs, the interest rates on credit applications, are some of the most highest out of any loans out there. So the best thing you can do is pay off that balance in its entirety each and every month. And of course, closing the account may not always be a good idea, because that account, especially if it's your first credit account, is associated with the age of your oldest credit experience. So when you close that date goes away with it. So please be mindful. And I see we have a question here. Let me see if I can follow that. How long does it take to increase your credit score, especially after negative reporting of late payments or high utilization? You paid down revolving credit, paid on time for 3 months. Thank you very much for that question. That is an excellent question, and you may not like the response, unfortunately. And the reason why is because it depends on so many other factors. And each individual's credit report varies significantly. Dates, balances, all of those associations and interrelationships make it very difficult to say how long. Typically, I'll answer the second part of that because that's an easier question. Utilization usually is impacted on a very short period of time, usually 90 days or less. So for example, if utilization is impacted by holiday spend, let's say, around the holidays, you maxed out the credit card. Your balance is nearly up to the limit. It's close to 100% utilized. Your score will be impacted if nothing else changes. So if you haven't been delinquent, if you haven't missed any payments, but utilization is the one thing that is dinging your score, usually within 2 months, your score will recover and may actually increase and be higher than it was before utilization increased. So utilization usually has a short time period. Delinquency, the unfortunate thing about delinquencies is that negative information stays on your credit report for up to 10 years. So therefore, it could take much longer to recover. But here's something that we would recommend. Most lenders, in fact, all lenders, are in the business of lending. They do not wish to turn anyone down for credit, nor do they wish to upset their customers, which they spend a lot of money to market to find and attract. So they are therefore always willing to negotiate. So if you've had a delinquency or you currently might have a past due amount, please call that lender and try to negotiate with them to turn that status into paid as agreed as quickly as possible. It might be a payment plan, it might be an extended term, but whatever it is, most lenders would rather negotiate with you and report and change the status as it's reported to the credit reporting agencies to current rather than delinquent. So there are some things within our control as consumers that we can self-advocate for ourselves to help us improve our scores. But unfortunately, delinquencies do take longer for scores to recover. Another question? Excellent question. Should we pay our minimum balance anytime before the due date? So this is a little bit tricky. The reason why is because every credit card company has a different schedule of when they report balances and payment information to the credit reporting agencies. So it kind of depends. Now, if it helps, if you know you're about to make a large purchase, if you're going to be shopping around for the best possible interest rate for a car loan, for example, or for a mortgage, then yes, I would say it is a good idea to pay as far in advance of the due date as possible, because the credit report that the lender will pull at the time of application for that big purchase, like a car or a home, will be in real time. And chances are by that time, let's say 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago when you would have made that payment, it would reflect the balance going down. So that's an excellent idea. However, over the long term, that has very minimal impact to your credit score. So it's only in the event when you know you're about to make a large purchase, you may want to use that strategy at your disposal. Thank you for that excellent question. Next slide, please. Okay, payment information, I already mentioned this. Again, any derogatory information, including public records and collection items, unfortunately can persist on your credit report for 7 years or some items up to 10 years. That's why it is really, really difficult to build back a credit score once you've had a mishap. But please be persistent. That happens all the time. We advise clients who have the need to rehabilitate their credit, don't give up, keep working on it. Don't think in terms of small points, think in terms of chunks. We'll get to that in a tip in just a moment. How do I get to the next 20 points? How do I rise the next 20 points? And that takes time if you have had delinquencies in the past, because again, that's the number one thing that drives the credit score. Is there somewhere you recommend that we can get a bad credit score back to 700 or better? So unfortunately, I cannot offer legal advice, which is what this question gets at. But one thing I will note is we can self-advocate for ourselves a lot of what you might see advertised to you as credit repair shops. So for example, first and foremost, get familiar with your own credit report. Make sure you understand all the content that is on there. Mistakes do happen. And if you have a legitimate delinquency that may be reported in your name, you're absolutely empowered to correct that. The consumer laws are on our side as consumers. And we'll talk about it in a few slides, how you can go about it, number one. Number two, again, try to negotiate with a lender or a collection agency that may reflect a negative history. They are more willing to work with you. So those are some of the things. And the third thing I'll mention is with a credit product. For example, a secured credit card. So if your credit score is very low because you may have had life events for unfortunate reasons or other uncontrollable reasons, this happens unfortunately to a large number of U.S. consumers. And it's really difficult to reestablish credit then again to get a credit. But one of the more accessible ways to do it is with what's called a secured credit card. And the best place to do that is with an existing institution where you already have an established relationship. They are more willing to offer you something like that. So whether it's a credit union, a community bank, a big national bank, most of them offer what's called a secured credit card. A secured credit card works like as follows. It's based on the premise that you have a depository relationship with that institution, meaning you have a checking or a savings account. And therefore, they can offer you a credit limit that is secured by your own money, by the deposit that you may already have with that bank. So for example, a $500 credit limit secured by your own deposit. On-time repayment on that credit card will absolutely improve your credit score over time. It may take several months, it may take a year or longer, but that is one excellent suggestion to think about reestablishing impaired credit, meaning if you have a really low score, is to start fresh with a new credit account, such as a secured card. All secured accounts are reported to credit reporting agencies, but the most important aspect about that is to never miss a payment again on that account. And your score will gradually improve over time. At a minimum, it usually takes 6 months for that score to start to recover. Excellent question. Unfortunately, it's a tough one because every individual's situation is different. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there's another question. How do you attain a credit score? Okay, thank you. That's free. Yes, excellent. I think we actually have a slide that talks about that. I'll mention it here since the question was raised. There are a few options. Some of them are free, some of them are not. So there are websites. I will not endorse any one of them, but I will just mention them as examples. Credit Karma, Credit Sesame, are some examples where you can get a credit score, such as Vantage Score, without any obligation. Mind you, you've heard the phrase, no such thing as free lunch. Here's where this is the case. When you consent to open a digital account with a company such as Credit Karma, I'm just using that as an example, that means you consent that they can use your personally identifiable information to market to you, to present from their partners, such as credit card issuers, marketing offers to you. So long as you're okay with that, that's what you're giving up, the right to be marketed to. However, there is no hard currency cost to you. It is for free that you can see your credit report and a credit score, such as Vantage Score. So that's one way. Many companies out there, even if you do not have a relationship with them, financial institutions, will offer access through their online website. Chase, Bank of America, Discover, those are some examples, big financial institutions that will offer you your own credit score for free. Another question, a medical company sent a bill 7 years ago. I paid this bill, but they said I didn't. It was late to get a bank statement showing payment due. Is this legal? So again, I will not address legal concerns. I'm not an attorney myself. What I will say is that if you have documentation, you can absolutely dispute any negatively reported information that you believe is erroneous on your credit report. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. And the onus is then on the data furnisher, in this case, the entity that is reporting a medical collection. The onus, the law, is that they must respond within 30 days. And if they cannot refute your evidence, by law, the credit reporting agencies have to change that in your, as the consumer's favor. It's a hassle. It's a pain in the rear end, admittedly. But absolutely, we would encourage persistence. And especially if you have documentation, to please consider all options, including disputes that are available to you. The best thing to do first and foremost is to contact that entity that is reporting that information and try to work with them. Okay, so here's an example, an illustration of utilization. With a credit card, all credit card issuers will give us what's called a credit limit. That's the maximum amount that we can spend up to each given cycle. A cycle is usually 30 days in a month. And of course, a month could span 2 months, right? As long as it's a 30-day window. So in that window, you have the opportunity to make purchases on your credit cards. And that's what's so great and so dangerous with credit cards, is that they do not have a specific purpose, right? Like a car, like a home, like an education. You can use your credit card for anything. But the convenience factor, the safety factor of credit cards, and the credit building capability that credit cards offer are incredibly powerful. So that's why it's so important to manage those credit cards responsibly. Utilization is one of those aspects. So with that credit limit, if we make purchases such as groceries, such as gas for transportation, such as taking a vacation, or even buying a pack of gum, or parking access to a game event like I did yesterday. That's why my voice is a little hoarse today, because I was rooting hard for my team. Unfortunately, they lost last night. But these are all the different places where we can use our credit cards. All of those purchases at the end of the cycle sum up to the balance that's due. And that's how utilization is calculated. So with the example here of a credit card that has a credit limit of $10,000, if you make purchases of $8,000, that is a very high utilization, 80%. $1,000 is an example of relatively low utilization. Now, in terms of what impacts a credit score, you may have heard this before, but it's that rule of thumb of 30%, let's call it, 1/3. So an example of $10,000, you do not want to charge up more than $3,000 in any given cycle for your score not to be negatively impacted. So if you keep your utilization relatively manageable, all else being equal, your credit score will gradually continue to rise over time. Next slide, please. I was following to see if there was a question. Okay, so let me just reiterate two important points. One is please be considerate when you're thinking about closing that credit account. And if the decision is, you know, I've outspent beyond my means because of that credit card, and in order for me to better budget my finances, I am better off just closing that account. If that's the decision, then that may be the right decision for you. However, if you're closing the account for any other reason, please think about it twice. Why? Because when you close that account, two things happen. Number one, the date associated with opening of that account also goes away. So your credit history, especially if it's your first credit card, it determines the length of your credit experience. When you close that account, that date disappears. So it will not help your score. It may, in fact, hurt your score. And the second thing is that utilization. Remember, the examples we've talked about so far is one credit card at a time. But what if you have more than one credit card? It's that total utilization. So you add all of your balances in the numerator, and you divide it by all of the credit limits as the denominator, and that's total utilization. So if you close one of those credit cards, one of those credit limits goes away as well. And so your denominator is, this is a little math, those of you who hated math back in school, your denominator shrinks and your utilization artificially expands, which is a bad thing. So if nothing else, if you can discipline yourself and not using the credit card you wish to close, and the choice is, do I keep it open or close it? Keep it open, unless, again, you're having a hard time managing that account. But if you keep it open, the age of oldest account stays with it, and that credit limit helps your utilization to be lower, the total utilization. So those are two kind of important reminders with regard to managing, especially credit cards. Next slide, please. Okay. So some of you have asked about seeing your free credit score. And this is where it gets a little tricky. There isn't a single credit score. I'll just mention two brands that you may have heard of. One is called FICO, which was the original credit score developed by Fair Isaac Company. And another one is called Vantage Score, which is built by the three credit reporting agencies. Now here's the bad news. It gets even more confusing. Each of those brands have multiple versions of their respective scores. They have one that's overall. They have one for mortgage. They have one for credit card, and so on and so forth. To make matters worse, every credit reporting agency builds their own scores. To make matters even more worse, virtually every financial institution builds what they call their custom scores, proprietary scores. I've spent most of my career doing just that. So there are literally hundreds and thousands of different credit scores. Now here's the good news. They are all built off of the same information. And that's the data, the information on your credit report, your adult report card. So therefore, the most important thing for you to consider is to stay on top of your credit report and the information that's on the credit report, because all of that drives all these different scores. Now, here's another good news. Directionally, they're all about the same. Now, you might say, why is there a need? Well, think about it. The U.S. consumer population that's adult and credit eligible is in the hundreds of millions. And we are blessed in an economy that has so many different options, and they all compete. It's like asking the question, if I need to get from point A to point B, and I would like to do that by something called the automobile, why do I need to have 30 plus different brands and different marks within each brand. It's the same thing to get from point A to point B, because we have different preferences, they have different features, we all have different utilities, and so on and so forth. For the same type of reasons is why we have different scores. It's a competitive marketplace, and every financial institution tries to get an edge over their competitors. And if they think they can squeeze out a single basis point of prediction by building their own credit score, they will. They will still use the generic scores like FICO and Vantage Score and so on. So directionally, they're all very much the same. They may vary. That's why you might get one score that shows a score of 700 and another score that shows a score of 740. It's important to realize they may be built on different scales, so they may not be equatable. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, a few more tips. So as I mentioned, there are many websites available at no cost, such as Credit Karma, Credit Sesame, Bankrate.com, many others. Your own financial institution may offer access to a credit report. You may have heard of CreditWise. That's a brand that is in fact marketed through TransUnion. That may offer free access to a credit report, and some of them a credit score. There are also paid monitoring services. So again, I'm not here to endorse my own company or our competitors, but each of the credit reporting agencies offer a paid-for service where you can view all three credit reporting agencies. You can view scores from each of the credit reporting agencies. My personal recommendation is you don't need all of that because you can get a lot of that for free. And maybe most importantly, it'll show, I believe on a slide that's forthcoming, is a website called annualcreditreport.com. That's a website that grants you, all of us as consumers, free access to our credit report from each of the three credit reporting agencies. Now, the name is a misnomer. When the three agencies developed this site years ago, they all agreed to allow, by law, actually, we were regulated to do this by the predecessor to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to offer every consumer in the United States free access to their credit report once a year. That's why the website is called annualcreditreport.com. But as a consequence of all the bad things that took place during and after COVID, the three reporting agencies agreed that we're going to offer consumers access to their credit reports for free every week. So you can refresh your own credit report on a weekly basis from each of the three credit reporting agencies. You will not get your scores for free or at all through that website. But the most important thing is the information on that credit report, because that's what drives your credit score. Those other websites I mentioned before, that's how you can access your free credit report. Next slide, please. Okay, now why does all of that matter? Remember, we started this presentation by suggesting that credit is not free. Credit is debt, obligation that must be repaid, and there's a cost to it. It's called interest rate or annual percentage rate. There are many different terms for that. This slide shows you the impact of the largest purchases most consumers in the United States make in their lifetime, which is purchasing a home. Most mortgages, home loans, are 30-year terms. So this is an example of a $300,000 loan for 30 years with an interest rate of 5% or 4%. Now, these may be unrealistic. This is just an illustration. Today's interest rates are a little bit higher than that. But what's important here is the difference of 1% on $300,000 borrowed over the course of 30 years. The difference comes out to about $64,000. Now, that's a pretty decent Tesla, wouldn't you say? So again, what makes that difference? It's the information on your credit report for one. obviously the value of the property. Many different things go into the decision of a loan, underwriting a mortgage. But the information on the credit report that translates into a credit score could make a difference of 1%. And that 1%, as this example demonstrates, could have a material financial difference over the course of our adult lives. Now, that matters with every credit product. It's most profound with the largest loans like mortgages, but consider credit cards, consider car loans. Interest rate costs add up over time. And if that interest rate is driven largely by the information on the credit report, that's why it's so important to stay on top of our credit information and to manage our credit response. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned this before. In addition to lenders, many other entities have legal right to view your credit report, not the least of which is employers. I believe most of you have gone through extensive background checks to be employed by the city of Chicago and so on. It may, in fact, have included credit background check as well. And so staying on top of credit and make sure that there's accurate information also may impact our employment prospects as well. Very important to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, another unfortunate trend that we have seen, and those of you in law enforcement probably see this on a daily basis, and that is the increased rise in identity theft. Identity theft has been on the rise for some time, but especially in the last couple of years, for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is an increased propensity for data breaches. Virtually every entity with whom you might do business or get service from holds very sensitive information about consumers. And so with these data breaches, it's much easier, therefore, to steal the identity of consumers. And unbeknownst to those with good credit, to use their good name to apply for credit and then not, obviously, pay for it. So that's the number one reason to stay on top of your credit report, in addition to access to credit and building credit and so on, is to make sure that nothing shows up on our credit reports that does not belong there. And of course, as one of you asked the fantastic question about making a payment or paying off a balance on a credit card in advance, if you know, especially, that you are in the market for a large loan obligation, like a car loan or a mortgage, it's really imperative to check your credit report as frequently as possible leading up to that purchase. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, two things. Number one, mistakes happen. And I'll use one example that happens quite a bit. Surnames. If you have a last name that's very common, especially if that last name has suffixes attached to it, such as junior, senior, second, or third, files could be mixed up. That happens the most frequently out of the mistakes, total mistakes that happen. Mistakes usually happen less than 5% of the total time. But when they do, they could be very impactful. So it's really important to monitor your credit information, including personally identifiable information, such as your demographic data, because these mistakes do happen. And then secondarily, as we just described, fraud happens. Fraud happens, or mistakes by the data furnishers, the finance companies. Keep in mind, credit reporting agencies do not make approve decline decisions. Those are made by financial institutions, and they sometimes report wrong information to the credit reporting agency. So if you do find mistakes such as that, or if you spot something that just doesn't belong there because it may have gotten there as a result of fraud, the consumer protection laws are on our side as a consumer. You may dispute it, and this is an example of how you do that with TransUnion on our website. It's a couple of clicks. Then you may be asked to provide documentation and so on, filing of a police report, if it's a fraudulent credit application and so on. But a lot of the process is automated and digitalized, and it's a lot less painful as it used to be. It's still onerous. I will not sugarcoat that. But there is a set process to go about that. So please become familiar with those steps should they ever become in need. Next slide, please. I think we're close to wrapping up here. Okay, a few more tips. Again, back to credit scores. Don't sweat the small point changes. If a score drops 5, 10 points or goes up, really immaterial. Most scores have what's called point to double the odds, meaning how do I get to the next level of odds of defaulting or not? That's what the scores predict. So usually that's in chunks of 20 to 40 points. So you want to set targets of how do I get to the next 20-point increment? If my score is currently 680, how do I get to 700? When you attain that 700, how do I get to 720? Fluctuations will happen, especially if you monitor your score on a weekly basis, for example. Information that gets reported to credit bureaus is daily, and not all creditors report at the same time. And if you look at your credit report from TransUnion and you compare it to Equifax or Experian, it may not show up. That information may not show up on the same day. It may show up on different intervals. So that's why minor score differences, like 10 points or less, don't sweat that. Set your targets 20 increments at a time. And hopefully all of you do regular health checkups, like annual physicals and such. Please consider treating your credit health in the same manner. Stay on top of it, monitor your credit report, set goals on how to improve your credit score. Lots of information, including on my company's website on TransUnion, on how to, some of the questions that you asked. There's a lot of free information available on our website, on our competitor websites, other third-party websites like Bankrate, Credit Karma, and so on. Please be careful because they will try to market to you, but the information is good, it's reliable, and it's certainly worthy of your consideration of your research. And I think with a few minutes to spare, I would be glad to entertain any additional questions. Thank you for the great questions you've surfaced so far. Any other questions? I think there was one question or a point about, is there a webinar about credit cards? I would love to come back and do a deep dive just on credit cards, because you're absolutely right. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of confusing terminology, especially if you've ever looked at the terms and conditions of a credit card application. It can get really, really crazy. I would be delighted to come back and do a webinar just on credit cards, if that would be helpful. Thank you for bringing that point up. Yes. Again, the first order is to find the credit card issuer behind the information that you think is wrong and contact them. By law, they are obligated to respond. And then contact the credit reporting agency, or do it at the same time. So between the entity that's reporting and the credit reporting agencies like TransUnion, they will work together to confirm the information. They may ask for additional documentation from you, but usually most of these are done electronically. And it's simply, if the consumer says the information should be X, but the information that's reported is Y, then correct it to make sure that it's X. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but it's kind of all done electronically. Thank you for those comments. Thank you so much. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully, you've learned a few nuggets that you will be able to use and improve your lives. All the best to you. Thank you so much.